one has to look carefully at the parallel passages as well. But let's look at this passage. First of all, he left the temple with his disciples, and they observed how magnificent the stones of the temple were. They were pointing it out. Look at these great stones. And they were great stones. I mean, Josephus and other authorities say that those stones were huge, enormous, fantastic. It was, the temple was one of the great wonders of the world. And the disciples were impressed with it. Why did they point out the stones? They'd seen them many times before. It's possibly because Jesus had just said, your house is left to you desolate. That is, he told the Jews that their house, the temple, not God's house. Earlier in his ministry, it was my Father's house. Remember when he said, don't make my Father's house a house of merchandise. That was the temple. He's no longer calling it his Father's house. The Jews have rejected Jesus. He's going to be crucified within days. And he no longer calls it my Father's house. He says, your house. This is yours. It's all yours. God doesn't own it anymore. Your house is empty, desolate. It's abandoned. Now, it may be because of that statement that the disciples said, but Lord, look at these stones. Why would God ever abandon this beautiful house? And his answer was, well, you see that? I'll tell you, the day is coming when not one of these stones will be left standing on another. They're all going to be thrown down. Now, you may know enough about first century history, you might not, to realize that that actually happened. The Romans attacked Israel and were in a bloody war with the Israelites for 3.5 years, beginning in 66 AD and ending in 70 AD. And in AD 70, the temple was destroyed and burned by the Romans. Every stone was taken down. What Jesus predicted came true in the year 70 AD. Okay? That's just history. The Bible doesn't record it, history records it. It's known to be a fact. Now, we find that the disciples come to him and they have a couple of questions for him, 2 or 3. This is where it gets a little tricky. In verse 3, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things be? That's the first question. And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, when will these things be must refer to what he predicted. They wouldn't just say these things without some kind of a reference, without some kind of a antecedent. He had just said the temples would be destroyed, leveled. Not one stone to be left on another. And when he said, when will these things be? The only way to understand their question would be, when is the temple going to be leveled, like you just said? When will this be? But they asked another question. In Matthew, it's rendered like this. And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, here's where looking at the parallels in Mark and in Luke could be instructive. The same story is in Mark 13. In verses 1 and 2, the same things we've just looked at. He walks out of the temple. Disciples comment on the stones. He predicts they're going to be thrown down. In verse 3, it says, now as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately. Now, Matthew just said his disciples. Here we're put a finer point on it. Well, not all his disciples. 4 of his disciples came to him privately and asked him privately, tell us, when will these things be? Okay, that's the same first question we found in Matthew 24:3. But then their second question is worded differently. And what will be the sign? Now, so far, that's the same. Because in Matthew 24, they said, when will these things be and what will be the sign? But then in Matthew, it says, the sign of your coming in the end of the age. Here it has, what will be the sign when all these things will be fulfilled? So you have the expression, these things, in both places. When will these things, the destruction of the temple, be? And what sign will there be that these things, the destruction of the temple, will be soon fulfilled? They want a general time frame, and they want some kind of warning sign. And it's interesting that in Mark, they asked about the same subject. 2 questions about the same subject. When will it be? Okay, give us some kind of a time frame here. And what sign might we look for to know that it's coming soon? He goes on after that the same way Matthew 24 does, but if you look over at Luke 21, we have the same story. And it's in verse 6 that he makes the prediction about the stones being destroyed or thrown down. And in verse 7, so they asked him, saying, Teacher, but when will these things be? So far, all three Gospels agree on that first question. And what sign will there be? So far, all three agree on those words too. What sign will there be when these things are about to take place? Now that sounds like Mark, because those are the same two questions that Mark has been asking. When will these things be? What sign will there be when these things are about to take place? Now the term these things obviously are referring to what he had predicted. Now if you look at Matthew 24 again then, in verse 34, Jesus said, assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away until all these things come to pass. Now they said, when will these things be? His answer was, this generation will not pass before these things be, before these things happen. He's answering their question directly. They asked for a time frame. He gave them one. Now, when I was younger and I thought that this was not talking about things that happened in the first century, and I thought these were things still unfulfilled in our future, I figured that when he said this generation will not pass, he didn't really mean that that generation would not pass, his own generation. My teachers actually told me that what he meant was the generation that begins to see these things start happening will not pass until it all happens. So he's not really giving them an answer to the question, when shall these things be? He's not telling them when they'll be. He's just saying when it starts to happen, whenever that might be, it'll happen within a span of a generation. But if that's what he meant, and he was talking about some future generation, one might think that he would say that generation will not pass, rather than this generation will not pass. Especially in view of the fact that about 5 other times in Matthew previous to this, he's used the expression this generation. And as far as I know, in each case, he was talking about his own contemporaries, like I'd be talking about this generation, people living at this one time. If I say this generation, or our generation, or talking about my generation, many of you are not old enough to know that song. But this generation, in all the other occurrences in Matthew, when that phrase is used, refers to the generation that saw John the Baptist and saw Jesus and rejected them both and said, John the Baptist, he's got a demon, and Jesus is a winebibber and a glutton, a friend of sinners. Jesus, that's what this generation is saying. And there's, you can look at the places when he said all these things in Matthew 23. He said all the blood guilt of all the righteous blood that was shed is going to come on this generation. And he also said in another place, in chapter 12, he said that to what shall I liken this generation? It's he said it's like it's like a man had a demon cast out, and 7 worse demons came in. So shall it be with this wicked generation. He had come to that generation. He'd cast out their demons. He'd given them, brought salvation, but they didn't receive him. And 7 worse demons came in. The nation became totally attacked by demons and Romans. If you read Josephus' account, you'll see that both were involved. Now, there's another view, and that is that the word genea, generation, really doesn't mean a generation like we use that term, but it means a progeny or a family or a race. Now, actually, the term can mean that. In certain contexts, it is possible for the word generation to mean a race or a people. When I was younger, I encountered people who argued that he means the race of the Jews will not pass away till all these things are done. So he would be saying then, these things are going to happen thousands of years off in the future, but the race of the Jews will still be around. However, I don't know why he would say this generation, the Jewish race will still be around, because no one asked him about that. they asked him some specific questions. Presumably, he's seeking to give them an answer. The question was, when will this be? If he says, well, this race will still be around, well, he's dodged the question and answered a question nobody was curious about. But if he's saying, this generation, people living right now, will not pass away until all these things are fulfilled, then he is answering the question, what is the time frame for this? Now, more than that, Matthew, when he's not using the expression this generation, still uses the word generation. Like in Matthew chapter 1, he talks about there were 14 generations from Abraham to David. And there were 14 generations from David to the carrying away into captivity under Jeconiah. And there were 14 generations from that time to Joseph, the husband of Mary. Now, the word generations there is not talking about races. There weren't 14 races and then 14 races and then 14. He's talking about generations the way we use the term. And he expects his audience to know that. So when he says this generation will not pass, all the data in the book of Matthew would suggest he means the people living at that time. More than that, he had made another very similar statement earlier than this in Matthew 16. And there he said in verse 28, assuredly I say to you, there are some standing here who shall not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Now, if there's some people standing there in his day who would not see death before they see this, that's the same thing as saying this generation will not pass away. Some people living in this generation will not yet be dead. So there's every reason to believe that Jesus is indeed giving a time frame when he says this generation will not pass. But the other question, and it did happen, by the way, 40 years later. How could it be more precise? He made the prediction in 30 AD. It was absolutely fulfilled in 70 AD, 40 years later. If he is saying that that generation would live to see the destruction of the temple, it is the most specific and accurate prophecy we have on record of Jesus ever making, of something that wasn't fulfilled in his own lifetime, but happened in the very time frame he said. So I'm of the opinion that when Jesus said, this generation will not pass till all these things are fulfilled, that he was talking about what they asked him about, which is a nice thing to do. It's a polite thing to do. If someone asks you a question and you go off at length for 35 verses, it's nice that you take a moment at least to address the question they asked you about. But what was the second question? Now, in Mark and Luke, the second question is rendered, and what sign shall there be that these things are about to take place? Certainly no evidence that these things in the second question are different than these things in the first question. They only have one thing on their mind. Jesus, by the way, had not mentioned to them the end of the world. He only mentioned that the temple would be destroyed, not one stone be left standing on another. They don't have any prediction from him about the end of the world here. So in Mark and Luke, they have him saying, the disciples saying, what shall be the sign that these things are about to take place? And if that is what they're asking, he actually answers that too. Because he says in verse 15, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop, not go down. Now, he says there is a sign you can look for. It is the sign of the abomination of desolation. We have that same expression used in Mark 13 in the parallel. And this expression, the abomination of desolation, is clearly taken from Daniel, as Jesus says in Mark 13:14. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Why? Because the very danger that's going to cause the temple to be dismantled is going to be dangerous for everybody in Judea. So when you see this, get out of there. I'm giving you some sign that you will see that this is about to take place. Now you'll notice that both Matthew and Mark have it, when you see the abomination of desolation, and then in parentheses it says, let him who reads understand. Like, okay, it may be that the reader might have trouble understanding this, but this is what Jesus said. I hope you'll understand what he's talking about here. Well, abomination of desolation is a very Hebraic statement from Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. Luke was writing to a Greek man who probably had no familiarity with Daniel. And Luke, when he comes to the very same place in the narrative, changes it. I would say interprets it or paraphrases it, because Luke knew what he meant. I believe Matthew and Mark knew what he meant too, but Matthew and Mark weren't sure their audience would know what he meant, because they'd say in parentheses, let him who reads understand. Like, maybe you won't. This is hard to understand what I'm talking about. Daniel spoke of the abomination of desolation. Hope you can understand. Well, Luke just assumed his reader, Theophilus, a Greek guy, wouldn't understand. So instead of saying that, he just kind of paraphrased it so that he could understand. And you find that in Luke 21, in verse 20. This is the very point in the discourse where Mark and Matthew say, when you see the abomination of desolation. In Luke 21:20, it says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then flee to the mountains, he says, just like Matthew and Mark said to flee to the mountains when you see the abomination of desolation. In Luke, it says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, its desolation is near. This is the abomination that's going to bring about its desolation. And it's time for you to flee. Now, you see then, if the disciples asked two questions about the destruction of the temple, which they apparently did, if you only had Mark and Luke and never seen Matthew, you'd never dream otherwise. They asked, when will it be? The answer is in this generation. The second question, what sign will there be that it's about to happen? Well, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, or what Daniel called the abomination of desolation, then you know it's near. So both questions are answered very directly in the discourse. Now, Daniel used the term abomination of desolation in 3 different places, but the place Jesus is referring to particularly, I think, is Daniel 9:27. Because in Daniel 9:26 and 27, it says that the Messiah is going to be killed, and then the people of the prince who is to come is going to come and destroy the city, Jerusalem, and the sanctuary, the temple. So, and the next verse refers to that as the abomination that causes desolation. So, what do we have? In Matthew 24, we have a prediction of the destruction of the temple, the disciples asking a question, Jesus answering the question. In Mark and Luke, they have 2 questions, and we find Jesus answering both. But in Matthew, their second question is reworded. In Matthew 24:3, their questions are said to be this: tell us, when shall these things be? Okay, all the Gospels agree about that question. And what will be the sign? Now, at this point, all the Gospels agree also. They said, what shall be the sign? But in the other Gospels, what shall be the sign that these things are about to happen? But in Matthew, it reads, what shall be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Now, the King James Version actually says, of your coming and the end of the world. Well, no wonder people have read this passage and think it's about the end of the world. But Jesus had not predicted the end of the world. Only the end of the temple, which was the end of the Jewish age, or what we call the Second Temple era. The disciples and all their ancestors for the previous 1,400 years had lived in the age of the law, the age of the Mosaic covenant, which was dominated by first the tabernacle, later the temple. The destruction of the temple was the end of that era. And the end of the era meant that's the end of the age that they were living in, and the age that they'd always lived in, and their ancestors had too. But what is the sign of your coming? Now you can see, when we think of the second coming of Christ, we immediately think of his second coming at the literal end of the world. Now, they didn't say the end of the world. They said the end of the aion, which is age. So the King James was a little confusing by translating the end of the world, because they probably were not thinking of the end of the world. Or maybe they were, Maybe they thought the destruction of the temple, since they knew nothing about beyond that, maybe thought that'd be the end of the world. Maybe they did. I can't say what they thought or didn't think. But according to Mark and Luke, they weren't asking about really the end of the world, but about the destruction of the temple.